All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting one to unpack today.
Yeah, this one's a bit of a doozy.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And it's something that, like we were talking about before we hit record, it's one of those things that it's really fundamental, Like it touches on like so many different aspects of like our everyday lives,
Oh, absolutely. Like, I mean, think about it, we got cars, what else? Drinks we drink, like the cans. I mean, it's just...
Yeah. Everything, the buildings we live in, like literally it is in so many different aspects of our lives.
It's the magic metal. Yeah.
It is. It's pretty crazy. But it's aluminum. That's what we're talking about today. And specifically, we got this great submission from a listener, right? About, that was talking about the rising tariffs on imported aluminum in the U.S. And, this is something that I'll be honest, like I don't think about tariffs all that often. Like, I don't know about you, but...
Yeah, no, not really. It's like one of those sort of in the background kind of things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Until, suddenly it's front and center and we're like, oh, wait.
What is a tariff?
Exactly.
Right. So anyway, but the mission today is to really like take this and kind of like go deep on it, and really try to understand like why are these tariffs being implemented? How are they actually going to affect things like prices and not just for like consumers, but also for different industries. And then like, what are the, kind of bigger implications here for, for the American economy and its infrastructure, right? Like it's
a big deal, right? I mean,
a deal.
Like we were talking about, just before we got going here, but like the fact that the U.S. used to have, what was it? Something like 30 aluminum smelters?
Yeah.
And now we're down to 4.
That's wild.
It is. So I think that kind of just highlights this sort of, I guess, the crux of what we're dealing with here. Like, on the one hand, you have this goal, the current administration's goal of trying to revitalize, domestic aluminum production and using these tariffs, as a lever to pull that off.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have like the potential for these increased costs that, CNBC piece does a really good job, I think, of laying out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this transcript paints a picture, right, of the U.S. sort of being in this tricky position, right? Because like we are the world's largest importer of raw aluminum, right? Like we buy more aluminum from other countries than anyone else.
Right.
But our ability to actually make it here in the U.S. has like dramatically shrunk, right? Like, which makes sense if we only have 4 smelters left.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. So,
and that's what I think has all the policymakers like scratching their heads and being like, okay, what do we do?
Well, right. And it's interesting, right? Because it is like a confluence of all these different factors. You have the supply, right? Like where does this aluminum actually come from?
Right.
You have the demand, how much aluminum do we need to consume and use here in the U.S.? And then you have the strategic considerations as well, right? Like how does this fit into our broader sort of, global economic, place, right? So the video, I think, does a good job. It's just a start, right? Because it provides, a very clear definition of what a tariff is.
Yeah.
Because, again, we were talking about it before. It's not something that's top of mind,
No, absolutely not.
Like what, So it basically lays it out that, a tariff is basically a tax, right? Yeah. That an importer has to pay when a product crosses the border.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we've seen this strategy before, right? Like, I mean, even just with the aluminum specifically, right? There was this initial tariff that was imposed. I think it was something like 25% on foreign aluminum. And the idea is that if you make that imported aluminum more expensive, then, companies will be like, well, hold on a second, maybe it makes more sense to produce this here in the U.S., right?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a nudge, right? Like a nudge to be like, okay, hey, let's produce this domestically.
Exactly. A little incentive, so.
Little incentive. But then you get into like what it actually takes to produce aluminum, right? Like, yeah. And the CNBC report really like kind of shines a light on something that was, pretty staggering for me.
Yeah.
Which is just the immense amount of energy that is required to actually produce this stuff.
Right. They mentioned that it's like 6 times more power hungry than even like those massive AI data centers, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, when you think about it, like those AI data centers are like, they're like basically like power plants onto themselves, right?
Yeah, they're massive, right?
Huge. Yeah.
And so for aluminum to be 6 times more energy intensive than that,
it's crazy. It's wild. And that really like, puts into perspective, right? Like the scale of the challenge here, right? Like if we really wanted to bring back significant aluminum smelting capacity to the U.S.
Right.
You're not just talking about, okay, well, we need a little bit more electricity from the grid.
No, it's like a fundamental shift, right, in terms of how we're generating and distributing power.
Yeah, exactly. Like so many different questions, right? About like, okay, well, where is that power going to come from? And then, what's that going to cost?
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Like, we're already dealing with, all these issues, right? About the power grid and like, making sure that we have reliable energy and all that kind of stuff. And so this is just like, it adds another layer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a major hurdle, I think, to overcome, to say the least.
Absolutely. But then on the other hand, despite all of that, right? Despite the fact that our aluminum production has shrunk, the U.S. is still a massive consumer of aluminum, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, just think about like beverage cans.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Like the numbers are mind-boggling,
Yeah, the video mentions that, something like 61 billion aluminum cans were discarded in 2024.
61 billion.
That's enough for about 12 packs for every person in the U.S.
Wow. I mean, I don't know about you, but
I don't think I'm drinking 12 packs.
I'm not drinking that much, but like some people
Some people are.
I guess, right?
Yeah. No, I think the point is just like the scale of our aluminum consumption is massive.
Yeah.
And that's just cans, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. Exactly. But there is a silver lining here, right? I mean, we also recycled a huge number of cans, right?
We did. 46 billion of those 61 billion were recycled.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, while we might be tossing a lot of aluminum, we're also pretty good at cleaning up after ourselves.
Yeah.
At least in this respect, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the transcript actually points out that 80% of the aluminum that's used in the U.S. every year is actually recycled aluminum.
Right.
So that puts us in a leading position, globally in terms of like aluminum recycling, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's definitely something to keep in mind, right? Because it's not all doom and gloom, right?
No, exactly.
Like, we are doing good things.
Yeah.
But, it also kind of underscores the fact that, well, cans, those are kind of the most visible, I guess, form of our aluminum consumption, right? Like, we all see them, we all use them. But the reality is that aluminum is used in so many other applications that we might not even realize, right?
Yeah. No kidding. I mean, they call it the magic metal, right?
They do.
And I mean, for good reason, right? Like, think about it. Up to 80% of an aircraft's structure is aluminum. Like, that's crazy. And then, it's an incredibly efficient conductor of electricity, right? So that's why it's used for like all those long distance power lines.
Right, right.
And it's also, they were saying it's critical for, so many different things like our energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, our national defense. I mean, it even helped make space travel a reality, right?
I mean, it's kind of wild when you think about it, right? Like, this one material is so ubiquitous in our lives.
Yeah.
And so I think what's really interesting here is that, you have this contrast, right? Like, we have this massive appetite for aluminum, right? Like we just talked about all the different uses for it.
Right.
But we have this limited capacity for, domestic primary production of it.
Yeah.
Like, the transcript reminds us, that the U.S. has relatively few deposits of bauxite.
Oh, right.
Which is like, the raw ore that aluminum comes from, right?
Like iron ores for steel, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that, oftentimes it makes more sense to just mine and do that initial production overseas, where those resources are more plentiful, right? And so, the major players in global aluminum production, it shouldn't come as a surprise, It's countries like China, India, Russia, Canada, places with those resources, right?
So that brings us to, kind of the history of these tariffs, right? Like, how did we get to where we are today?
Yeah.
So the U.S. initially imposed a 10% tariff on aluminum imports back in 2018.
2018, okay.
And it's interesting because our close neighbors and like our key trading partners, right, like Canada and Mexico, they were actually exempt at first.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So they didn't have to pay that tariff. But then later on, during the Biden administration, we started seeing these quotas being negotiated, right?
Yeah.
With the European Union and the UK.
Okay.
And so by February of 2025, the effective tariff rate had actually dropped quite a bit, down to just 3.91%.
Wow.
According to S&P Global. So, things were kind of like trending downwards in terms of the tariff.
So why the change?
Yeah, right.
Right. What's going on?
And so that's what's really interesting, right, is that now like the landscape is shifting, pretty dramatically. The U.S. is now increasing that tariff to a flat 25%.
Wow. Okay.
On all imported aluminum starting in March.
Of this year.
Yeah. So like a couple of weeks, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a huge jump, right? From 3.91% to 25%. And one of the crucial details here, right, that the CNBC report points out is that this tariff applies specifically to the aluminum content of a product, not the entire finished product.
Okay, now break that down for me because that sounds kind of complicated.
Yeah. So like think about like a car door, right?
Okay.
Like a car door obviously has aluminum in it, right?
Right.
Okay.
But it also has other materials, right? Like steel and plastic and all kinds of other stuff, right?
Yeah, sure.
So the tariff only applies to the weight of the aluminum in that door, not the whole door assembly itself.
Okay. Okay.
So, and that's where it gets tricky, right? Because now, like, manufacturers need to be really precise, right? With like their material tracking and like how much aluminum is actually going into each product.
Oh, wow.
And so that adds another layer of complexity, right?
Thanks
To their operations.
Yeah.
And potentially, that could lead to higher costs.
Right, right. So it's not just the potential for higher prices in terms of the aluminum itself,
Yeah.
but also, like you said, this added layer of administrative burden, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, yeah, it's kind of a double whammy, right? Like
Yeah.
for businesses. And speaking of those higher prices, the industries that are like big users of aluminum, right? Like the car manufacturers, they're understandably concerned, right? About like whether they're going to have to pass those increased costs on to us, to consumers.
Right. And I mean, that's a valid concern, right? Like nobody wants to pay more for a car
No.
or, a can of soda or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Exactly. And, the housing industry has also, voiced concerns about this, right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because aluminum is used in a lot of building materials. And so, if the price of aluminum goes up, the price of those building materials is probably going to go up too.
Right. And they were saying that like there was this analysis done by CoreLogic.
Right.
And they were focusing on, like various building materials, obviously aluminum being one of them.
Yeah.
And they were saying that like these tariffs could add as much as $22,000
$22,000.
to the cost of a new home over the next year.
Wow.
That's a lot of money.
It is. And I mean, especially for people who are trying to buy a house,
Right.
like that's a significant impact.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But then, you also hear the other side of the argument, right?
Right.
Where people are saying, well, hold on a second,
Yeah.
like for a lot of products, aluminum actually only makes up a small fraction of the total cost. So the overall price increase for consumers might actually be pretty minimal.
Right. Like the video uses the example of, a $40,000 car.
Okay, yeah.
They're saying that, because of the aluminum tariff, the price of that car might go up by like $75.
$75. Okay.
Which, I mean, it's not nothing,
It's not nothing.
but it's also not, $20,000.
Right, exactly. And so, it really depends, right? Like
It does, yeah.
on the specific product and like how much aluminum is actually in it.
Exactly.
But then the transcript also brings up this other like kind of interesting point, right? Which is that, maybe businesses will adapt, right?
Right.
In ways that we don't even anticipate yet.
Right.
Like they brought up Coca-Cola.
Okay.
And they were saying that like, Coca-Cola has reportedly considered shifting towards using more plastic bottles
Wow. Okay.
if the price of aluminum gets too high.
Interesting.
Right.
So like a substitution?
Yeah, like a substitution. And I mean, think about that. Like if you went to the store and like all the Coke bottles were plastic now.
Right. That would be a noticeable change.
Yeah, there would be a huge change,
Yeah.
right? Like that's something that we would definitely notice as consumers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about, where this imported aluminum is actually coming from, right?
Okay.
Because like we're obviously importing a lot of it.
Yeah.
And it's coming from specific places, right?
Right.
And so like the big two are Canada and China,
Okay.
right?
Those are the major sources?
Those are the major sources, yeah. And then there's been a lot of talk recently, right, about like potential additional tariffs on all goods coming from those countries,
Right.
but also Mexico.
Right. Yeah.
And so like what that could lead to is, what they're calling stacked tariffs on aluminum products.
Okay. Now explain that one to me.
Yeah. So basically, if we put tariffs on all goods coming from, say, China, and then we also have this specific tariff on the aluminum content of products,
Yeah.
that means that aluminum products coming from China are going to get hit with a double tariff.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it's like...
So like a tariff on top of a tariff.
Exactly. And so, that could obviously lead to even higher costs down the line.
Right. I mean, it just sort of like compounds the problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing to think about here is like the potential for strained trade relationships.
Right. And especially, I mean, the transcript really highlights this with Canada, right? Because we have this, very close relationship with Canada, both economically and, sort of like politically and culturally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if we start, messing around with tariffs and, making it more expensive to import aluminum from Canada,
right,
that could have some ripple effects, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And they bring up, the example of Alcoa, right?
Alcoa, yeah.
Which is this, big aluminum company that has operations on both sides of the border.
Oh, okay.
And they rely heavily on Canadian aluminum imports, right?
To feed their facilities here in the U.S.?
Yeah, exactly. So, like, they're bringing in aluminum from Canada to process and, turn into whatever products they're making here in the U.S., right?
Interesting. Okay.
So if we start buying less aluminum from Canada, companies like Alcoa are kind of in a tough spot, right?
Yeah. What are their options?
Exactly. They could either, try to buy more expensive domestic aluminum,
right,
assuming it's even available in the quantities they need,
right,
or they can continue to buy the Canadian aluminum, but now they're paying a much higher price because of the tariff.
Right. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, exactly. And the transcript mentions this, like, significant jump in the premium for U.S. Midwest aluminum.
Okay.
Like, it went up over 60% between January and like the beginning of March of this year.
Wow. Okay.
So like the price is already going up.
Yeah. Right.
And it's not just the raw aluminum that's affected, right?
Right.
Like even the prices for recycled aluminum are starting to climb as well.
Interesting. So like the whole market is kind of reacting to this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And here's a really like surprising statistic, right? That kind of underscores how interconnected our economies are.
Okay.
The video points out that for every single job in Canadian aluminum smelting, there are 13 jobs supported in the U.S.
Wow.
So like we rely on that Canadian aluminum, right?
Right.
To keep our existing furnaces running.
So it's not just about, like competition, right?
Right.
It's like we actually need that Canadian aluminum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
so like if Canada becomes less of a, viable source for us, right?
Right.
The video mentions some potential alternatives like India, the Middle East, Australia.
Okay.
And then further down the list are China and Russia.
Right. Which, each of those obviously comes with its own set of, considerations.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So what's the driving force behind all of this, right?
Right.
Like, why are we doing this? Why are we putting these tariffs in place?
Right.
And the main argument seems to be about, revitalizing the U.S. industrial base, right?
Right.
Like, there's this concern that, our domestic manufacturing has declined.
Especially in these, like, foundational sectors, right? Like metals.
Exactly. And they specifically point to China, right?
Yeah.
As being like a major contributor to this shift, right?
Yeah. I mean, the transcript goes into a lot of detail about, like, how China really strategically targeted the metals industry, like both steel and aluminum, for global dominance, right?
Oh.
And they did it through a variety of means, right? Like they had massive government subsidies. They had subsidized energy costs, preferential financing for their industries, and even like allegedly intellectual property theft.
Wow.
And so, they were able to produce aluminum at like artificially low prices.
Wow. Okay.
And that made it, really difficult for producers in the U.S. and other countries to compete, right?
Right.
And so the video also highlights how, China has really made advancements in aluminum smelting technology, which, as we talked about earlier, is a very energy intensive process. Electricity accounts for a huge part of that cost.
Okay.
And so, it's kind of like, if you think about it, like a company that's intentionally underpricing its products to drive competitors out of business.
Right.
But on like a global scale, right?
Wow.
And with like government backing.
Yeah. So it's kind of like playing the long game, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like they're willing to, take a hit in the short term to dominate the market in the long term.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a compelling argument, right? Like
absolutely.
For putting these tariffs in place, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to, create a more level playing field and protect our own domestic industries, But, the big challenge, as we've been talking about, is actually bringing that aluminum smelting capacity back to the U.S.
Right.
Like, it's one thing to say, okay, well, we want to produce more aluminum here.
Right.
But the actual, obstacles to building these new smelters, they seem really significant.
Oh, they are, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, the transcript emphasizes this need for a long-term commitment to energy provision.
Right.
Particularly electricity, right?
Right.
Like, if you're a company and you're thinking about building a new smelter,
Yeah.
you need to know that you're going to have a guaranteed supply of electricity for at least 25 to 30 years.
Wow. Okay.
Right? Like, that's a huge commitment, right?
That's a huge commitment.
And then on top of that, the timeline to actually get that smelter built and operational,
Right.
You have to factor in site selection, environmental permitting, the actual construction, and then, finally getting it up and running, producing aluminum.
Right.
That's estimated to take about 8 to 10 years. So you're talking about a massive undertaking.
Yeah. And the fact that no new aluminum smelter has been built in the U.S. in the last 45 years.
Yeah, that says something, right?
Really underscores how difficult this is, right?
Yeah.
And then, on top of all that, you have to think about the strain that these facilities would put on the power grid.
Right. I mean, we talked about earlier just how energy intensive they are.
Yeah.
So, it's not just a matter of, okay, well, we'll build a new smelter and we're good to go.
Yeah.
There are all these other cascading effects that we have to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes you wonder, why did we move so much of this production overseas in the first place?
Right. Well, right. Like, it's clearly not, an easy thing to do here.
Yeah, exactly. And then, the other kind of wrinkle in all of this, right, is that the demand for aluminum is actually increasing.
Increasing.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, they were saying it's because of all these emerging technologies, right? Like electric vehicles, solar panels, advanced electronics like smartphones. All of that stuff uses aluminum, right?
Right.
And so as those technologies become more and more prevalent,
the demand for aluminum goes up.
Yeah, exactly. And so our current domestic supply just isn't enough to meet that growing demand.
So even if we did want to, bring all of that production back,
yeah,
it's not clear that we could.
Exactly. And so, while the U.S. might still be, a decent place to produce aluminum in some ways,
right,
we also face a lot of competition.
Right, especially for resources like energy.
Yeah, exactly. Like we were talking about those data centers earlier.
Right.
Like those things are sucking up huge amounts of energy, right?
Yeah.
And so if we're going to build new aluminum smelters, we're going to be competing with them for that energy.
Right.
And so, the transcript mentions this one current U.S. smelter project that's under consideration.
Okay.
And it would require something like 700 to 1,000 megawatts of electricity, which is a lot.
It's a ton.
Yeah. And on top of that, they need a long-term commitment to affordable energy rates.
Right. So it's not just about getting the electricity. It's about getting it at a price that makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's a huge undertaking to try to bring all of this aluminum production back.
Yeah. It's not a simple problem.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of bring this all to a close, right?
Okay.
What we've learned is that, the U.S. is increasing these tariffs on imported aluminum.
Right.
And their stated goals are to boost our own production capabilities and push back against what they see as, unfair foreign competition, particularly from China.
Right.
And so, that could potentially be good for some domestic industries, right?
Right.
Like if we're producing more aluminum here, that's good for those companies.
Right.
But it also carries some risks.
Right. Like we talked about, the potential for higher prices, both for consumers and businesses, the potential for friction with our trading partners.
Yeah.
And then also, just the immense challenge of securing all the energy that we would need.
Right. To support that new production.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's not a simple solution. Right?
No, it's definitely not. And I think what really comes out of this, right?
Yeah.
Is that this is a really complex situation.
Yeah.
You're trying to balance national security interests, domestic economic goals, with the potential for increased cost, disruptions to these intricate global supply chains.
Yeah.
It's a multifaceted challenge that doesn't have any easy or straightforward answers.
No, absolutely not. And so, I guess the question that we're left with, right? For you, the listener, right?
Yeah.
Is,